This is MichMash, a weekly conversation where we try to unjumble an important and sometimes under-the-radar statewide story that affects you. I'm Cheyna Roth.
And I'm Zach Gorchow. We are coming up on the final weeks of the Democratic trifecta government here in Michigan. And there is one issue that journalists, and really anyone who cares about transparency in government, are especially focused on.
During her campaign, Governor Gretchen Whitmer made updating the state's transparency law, known as the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, a part of her campaign for governor. Michigan is one of only two states whose governor and legislature are exempt from their state's FOIA. Zach, given that Republicans are going to take control of the House after the first of the year, do you think she'll be able to make good on this promise?
Well, Cheyna, I think skepticism, even cynicism, is warranted. Democrats spent years hammering at Republican trifectas for refusing to expand FOIA to the governor's office and the legislature. But then Democrats get control, and while State Senator Jeremy Moss, a Southfield Democrat, has really championed this effort and did get it through the Senate this term, the issue is right back where it's been in recent legislative terms, through one legislative chamber and on life support in the other, in this case, the House of Representatives. It's also important to note that Governor Whitmer said in 2018 she'd issue an executive order applying FOIA to her administration if the legislature refused to act. But once in office, she flip-flopped and decided not to do that, saying only a law expanding FOIA to both the executive and legislative branches would suffice.
Now, we've seen various versions of bills to make the governor's office and legislature susceptible to FOIA for years. I'm pretty sure it's one of the first issues I dug into as a baby reporter. And it has had and currently has bipartisan sponsors. So what has been the holdup?
Well, like so many enduring mysteries this year in Lansing, it all comes back to House Speaker Joe Tate. He's kept the legislation bottled up in committee all year, the same fate befalling a large, and I do mean large, number of substantive bills. In fact, just today, we're recording on December 4th, he still said just conversations are being had on FOIA, so who knows. And up until this week, Tate was essentially underground for 5 months, so there's not a lot of answers as to why he hasn't moved.
I tell you, Zach, with all the problems the Democratic majority is having right now, coalescing behind an agenda, expanding FOIA to the legislature and governor's office, paradoxically, might give us some answers as to why that legislation is going nowhere. We're in a weird little spiral right now.
Big time. And, tip of the iceberg on what FOIA might be able to tell us about what's going on in the legislature right now.
Well, we're going to take a short break, but stick around because Zach and I are going to discuss the bombshell announcement this week from Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan that he's running for governor, get this, as an independent, not as a Democrat. And then we will be joined by Lisa McGraw from the Michigan Press Association to talk more about FOIA and why she thinks it's so important that the current legislation is passed. We'll be right back. Welcome back to MichMash. I'm Cheyna Roth here with Zach Gorchow. And as we alluded to before the break, huge announcement this week. Zach, you texted me that Mayor Mike Duggan had announced he would be running for governor. And my first thought was, oh, that seems a little early. And then I actually read an article, and then the real news hit me. He's running as an independent.
Just shocking. I saw the press release come into my inbox, and I just kind of stared at it for a minute, processing this. Mike Duggan is a lifelong, stalwart Democratic Party member. This is a guy who was the late Wayne County Executive Ed McNamara's right-hand man. This was somebody who, championed Joe Biden's presidential campaign. He was elected as Wayne County prosecutor as a Democrat. I just never even conceived that he would consider this route of not seeking the Democratic nomination for governor, and instead he'll have to go out and gather petition signatures to get on the ballot as a candidate without partisan affiliation. That means he would skip the primary and go straight to the November 26th general election ballot. I just can't believe it.
So let's dig into Let's start with the thought process going on here, because I feel like that's where a lot of people might be scratching their heads, because he is known as a Democrat. We have a very clear two-party system. I don't know that any independent has been able to take the governor's seat ever. It's so much harder to get on the ballot as an independent. So what is the calculus here?
Well, we're recording on Wednesday, December 4th, basically 2 hours after this announcement. So we're still learning some more about it. But I saw before we began recording, he told the Detroit News that he made the decision to do this not long after this November election when Trump won the presidential race. And so that tells me he must be looking at a general anti-politician mood right now. And thinking, if I ran as a doer, somebody who was instrumental to Detroit's comeback in recent years, ran as somebody who led the Detroit Medical Center, somebody who has gotten things done, whether that's the Detroit Metro Airport expansion or all of the, improvements in Detroit, that would be more appealing than, hey, I'm the Democratic nominee for governor. So I think that must be part of it. I can't help but think, this is politics. So, there had to be a political calculation. He must have been concerned about his ability to win a Democratic primary, which presumably is going to include Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, younger, to Duggan's left, which is a good place to be in a Democratic primary. And men have done very poorly in Democratic primaries where a woman is running in the last 3 decades. In fact, if you were to look at U.S. Senate and gubernatorial primaries in the last 30 years, if there's a man in the race and a woman in the race, a man has not won since 1994. And so I have to think all of this was part of the calculation.
Do you think that a part of that calculation might also be the fact that Democrats are just having a very hard time winning right now? And I say that with the sort of caveat that this election is not for another couple years. And so do you think that this is going to end up, sort of biting him, and that Democrats will be winning because they will be up against a Republican in the White House? And, usually Democrats tend to do well, whatever party is not in the White House tends to do well in those midterm elections. I don't know. I feel like his calculus seems to be very of the current moment and maybe not looking far enough ahead.
I agree, Cheyna, and I've been resisting getting into hot takes here, but I mean, I don't really understand this. The last 2 midterms, 2018 and 2022, have been monster years for Democrats in Michigan. They've won basically everything at the statewide level. And with a Republican, Donald Trump, presumably in the White House in 2026, it should theoretically be a pretty good year for a Democrat in Michigan. Now, there's one huge caveat to that. I think this could be part of what Mike Duggan's considering. Michigan has a history in the governor's races of when a governor chooses not to seek reelection or can't seek reelection because of term limits, voters tend to pick a candidate of the non-incumbent party to replace them. In fact, we haven't had a governor elected succeeding an outgoing governor of the same party since 1960. Since 1960. John Swainson succeeding Soapy Williams. There's been this pattern that the governor's office flip-flops back and forth, and that has got to also be something that Mike Duggan is considering. And the last thing I would say about that is, while in theory it should be a good year to be a Democrat because there's a Republican in the White House, one thing we saw in 2022 when there was a Democrat in the White House, and that should have been a good year for Republicans in Michigan, it wasn't. Michigan voters seemed to make their own decision on who would be best to be governor in Michigan, irrespective of who was in the White House, that being Joe Biden at the time, and reelected Governor Whitmer by a huge margin. And so that would give me some pause if I were Mike Duggan about the idea of running as a Democrat. when Michigan voters historically might be saying, hey, it's time for change. That time for change argument is very potent in these governor's races.
So we have thus far been trying to dig into the reasoning for this and kind of coming up with maybe some arguments against doing this. I will say that if I really hone in here, if anybody could run as an independent and win, it might be Mike Duggan. I mean, he has been a fairly popular mayor of Michigan's largest city for a while. He has some pretty good name recognition, maybe not great, the further away from Detroit that you get, but it's definitely, he has a pedigree that I think is relatable to people and that he can really use to his advantage. And let's not forget that he is a very charismatic politician. He knows how to speak to people. He knows how to present himself as a sort of like hardworking everyman. And I think that if it does end up being an election where people are like, you know what, I'm really not happy with the status quo and the establishment. But then you also have this factor of there's been a Republican in the White House and maybe people are disillusioned by that. That might be like the ideal conditions for an independent to make it.
I think you make a good point, Cheyna. So let's try to break this down and like how this could work for Mike Duggan. You hit some key points. Huge name recognition in the most vote-rich part of the state, metropolitan Detroit. There's 5 million people there. I'd venture to say almost all of them know who Mike Duggan is, and he's pretty widely respected for his leadership of the city, and that will put him in good stead. He has the fundraising connections. He already has the endorsement of Bill Ford Jr. He's going to be able to raise a lot of money and be able to fund, a pretty strong campaign. And he's very experienced at this. I mean, let's not forget, this is a guy who was able to win as a write-in candidate for mayor in Detroit in 2013. That was an incredible achievement and really proved his bona fides. But I will say, when this announcement came in, my immediate reaction was the Republicans just won the governor's race. Mike Duggan's a Democrat. He may be running as an independent, and he may be more pro-business than your average Democrat, but Mike Duggan is still somebody who supports abortion rights. He is still someone who, as the Wayne County prosecutor, wanted to sue gun manufacturers. There is a long list of issues that he simply does not sync up with Republican voters. I just can't help but think that, yes, Republicans in metropolitan Detroit might be like, yeah, I like Duggan. He's done a nice job with the city. Good for him. Respect him. But I'm not voting for him for governor because I disagree with him on too many key issues. So that's going to be a huge hurdle for him. And that means the Democratic vote is likely to be carved up. There's only so many Democratic votes to go around. And I just can't help but think that any Republican who's ever had any thought of running for governor has just got to be licking their chops and thinking, this is, we already had the benefit of saying time for change after 8 years of Governor Whitmer in office. Now we're going to have the Democrats competing for the same pool of votes. This is it. This is our chance. If they can nominate any kind of competent candidate, they should be in a tremendous position if there is a Democratic nominee for governor and Mike Duggan on the November 26th ballot.
But given what you said earlier about how sort of the far left is the candidate is the one that wins in the primary for Democrats, I believe the far right candidate could be the one that wins in the primary for Republicans. And if you get somebody who is like an uber Trump or far right, I mean, Duggan might be in that sweet spot of like the people who don't want that and are like, well, I can stomach Duggan because of X, Y, and Z, because he does lean a little bit more moderate. But then again, you've got him kind of chomping from both sides. And I don't know. I think this is going to be an incredibly interesting race to watch over the next, 2 years?
Yeah.
Year and a half?
We've never had a situation like this where there is a viable, serious, credible independent candidate for governor along with the two major party nominees. And it's hard to predict how that's going to play out. We also still have straight ticket voting in Michigan. So a lot of people may pick straight Republican or straight Democratic. That's an obstacle for Duggan, but at least it's the governor's race, which is super visible and could help him overcome that. I think the key for Duggan is he needs a super crowded Republican primary that produces a candidate that isn't terribly well funded or well known and is kind of out there on the right. And the Democrats have something similar happen. And it sort of leaves him as like, hey, I'm the sensible mainstream candidate. You can trust me to do the job well. And he ends up having a fundraising advantage. But it's going to be tough. Who's going to do the work of a Duggan campaign? I mean, it's one thing to campaign in the city of Detroit. Now you're talking a statewide race. I mean, you need troops, you need people. And historically, the political parties provide that. And now Duggan's going to have to build that from scratch. But this is Mike Duggan is a savvy operator. And if anybody can pull it off, I mean, I think it is him.
All right. That's enough of that bombshell. We are going to take a quick break. And then when we come back, we'll be joined by Lisa McGraw from the Michigan Press Association. Stick around.
Welcome back. I'm Zach Gorchow. Joining Cheyna and me now is someone who probably has the Michigan Freedom of Information Act memorized. Lisa McGraw, Public Affairs Manager for the Michigan Press Association, has been fighting for years to get the state's public records law expanded to the governor and legislature and for all sorts of other transparency enhancements. Lisa, welcome to MichMash.
Thank you, Zach.
So, Lisa, let's start with this. Can you explain why the current bills in front of the state legislature are important?
Well, because first of all, Michigan is the only state, or one of only 2 states in the country, that the governor and the legislature are not subject to FOIA. And it's important because the people in the state have a right to know what their legislators are doing, what their governor is doing, as they already have that ability with local government officials on every level, and even state departments, and the Attorney General and the Secretary of State.
And Lisa, what would if you were to expand FOIA to the legislature and the governor's office, meaning the members of the public, members of the media could file requests for communications between legislators, between staff members for the governor. Do you think that would prevent some of the scandals we've seen, or could it have helped bring those to light sooner in the legislature? We've got, multiple former speakers either under investigation or under criminal charges, or one even sitting in prison right now.
Right. Yes, I absolutely do think if you're not acting in the dark, and that there is the ability for people to find out what you're doing, it would definitely improve some things. Obviously, there would have to be even more campaign finance sort of openness involved eventually too, to really make it work super well, especially with regard to some of the situations you're talking about, Zach, with former speakers, it seems like, for the most part.
You've heard the argument from legislators in the past that opening up their communications to the public would prevent them from having open discussions with colleagues and their ability to sort of get their legislative work done. What do you say to that?
Well, I have to think of how to say this in a family way. I would say, first of all, every other governmental entity in the state has to comply with that. So why are they special? And I have no idea why they think that they should be able to do that kind of stuff behind closed doors.
You raise a great point. Every member of a city council, every member of a township board, every mayor's office, they're all subject to FOIA, and their communications are open to the public, subject to a number of exemptions that would theoretically also apply to the legislature if they would apply this to themselves. But have you been able to get any sense from the Speaker of the House, Joe Tate, on why he has let these bills collect dust since they passed the Senate? Because let's just reset it for people. The Michigan Senate did pass legislation to expand FOIA to the legislature and the governor's office, but they are just sitting over in the House, and the clock is ticking before the end of the legislative term.
And I would add that it's passed the state House in previous sessions 4 times unanimously. No, I have spoken to the speaker, but I really can't get a read on why this isn't going, because I've met with multiple members of the House who say they support it. Future Speaker Matt Hall, I think a week ago, told a reporter that he would vote yes on it if it were to come up on the floor. So I'm not sure what the holdup is.
It seems as though there's a lot of willingness to talk about this, but not a lot of willingness to like get things done and like actually have action on these bills. But you have been working with some people in the legislature who are major allies in this and who want to get these bills pushed through. Who are your biggest allies in the legislature right now, and what are they thinking going into the end of the year?
The biggest allies on this issue are and always have been Senator Ed McBroom and Senator Jeremy Moss. They've worked together every session since 2016 to get these bills. When they were state House reps, they were super about it, and they got it through the House when they were there. They got it through the Senate this year. They understand the importance. It passed the Senate with just 2 votes shy of being unanimous. And that's where we are right now. I've never in all the years actually heard someone say, no, I don't support this, except for the 2 senators who voted against it last spring. And they didn't say that to me. They just voted against it. But when you talk one-on-one with most legislators, they say, oh, yeah, that's important. And I don't mean to throw snark here, but it seems to me the minority party is always incredibly supportive of it, no matter which party that is.
Our House reporter at Gongwer, Elena Dernbaugh, we're recording on December 4th, and she spoke with Speaker Tate this morning, and maybe not surprising, no real breaking news on this. All he told her is there are still conversations being had regarding the FOIA legislation, and that has really been his mantra all the way along. What you just said about the minority party is a good segue, I think, to this next question, which is this seems to have just become something for the minority party to club the majority party with. Democrats for years, when they had no power in the minority, championed expanding FOIA to the legislature and hammered the Republicans for blocking it. But now they've had control for almost 2 full years, and it's no farther along. It's only past one chamber. It's not to the governor's office. And yet here come the Republicans in the minority praising the idea. I mean, this must just make you want to tear your hair out that no one so far seems to really want to make this happen. What do you make of it?
Just that. It's a great clubbing device. They don't support transparency. They could, and you're absolutely right. It's been both sides. I always say it's a bipartisan issue, but not in the right way. I would like to see that change. And again, I mean, I've talked to Democrats who support it too. It's not just Republican House members who are saying it's time to do it. There are Democrats who feel that way too.
Are you at all optimistic that if this doesn't pass this year, that you will have better luck with bipartisan government?
Yeah, no. I actually I've spoken with my members about what our next steps are on this issue, and I plan to meet with my public policy team, Zach, in the near future to discuss what our priorities are going to be next year, and I'm afraid this might not be one of them at this point. There are a lot of FOIA issues that need to be addressed in the state that have kind of been held off while we try to get this done. And I don't have a lot of faith that it could happen next year. That being said, as I said a little bit ago, Speaker-elect Hall has said he supports it. So we'll see. The governor has also stated support for it in the past. but we haven't heard from her on it this time.
Well, let's talk about the governor on this issue, because her history on this is pretty well noted, and yet is important to flag yet again. So in 2018, when then former Senator Gretchen Whitmer was running for governor, she made it very clear not only did she support expanding FOIA to the governor's office in the legislature, she said, and it's in writing, she would expand it unilaterally to the governor's office using her powers of executive order if the legislature did not send her a bill to put it into statute, because there's nothing stopping the governor from voluntarily complying with FOIA. She could issue an executive order, an executive directive, and require disclosure of communications along the lines of FOIA. Instead, not long after she became governor, she declared she would not do that. She wanted a bill signed into law requiring both the legislature and the governor to comply with FOIA. So how would you rate Governor Whitmer's efforts now almost 6 years into her tenure to fulfill her 2018 promise on FOIA?
Low. Very low. I mean, I don't know if there's been any effort whatsoever. And you're right. I mean, those of us who want this to happen and care about transparency in Michigan, I think we all have a copy of that Sunshine Report sitting on our desks, but where she stated that, and it was the number one transparency issue in that report. But no one has said to me, oh, the governor's really pushing for this, or, she wants to see this happen. I know that at one point, when it was a different iteration of the bill that gave the legislature their own Legislative Open Records Act, the first several times, she didn't like that. She wanted them on the same footing with her. That's been done now. She's been granted exceptions that we have worked through with her office and the senator's offices to protect her safety and her family's safety. We understand that, as we do with the legislators. One of the big concerns that's come up over the years is, if we put everywhere we're going to be on our calendar, we shouldn't put our calendar out until after the fact. And we agreed, fine, take out the location, just tell us who you're meeting with and when. I'm going off on a tangent here, but as you know, Zach, we have caved. I hate that word, but we have compromised, is a good way to say it, on many, many of these issues. I continue to dig at the constituent email issue, but get nowhere with it because I feel like it's a tunnel that's wide open. There's another exemption for the governor that allows for no release of information about commutations and pardons. I don't think that's a good idea either. It could be quite fraught if something went wrong. But this is, as Senator Moss has said, this is the ground floor, and we need to get a foundation put in place. And that's what these bills are. So we continue to support.
So given that these bills are essentially going on the back burner, what are the priorities going to be for your organization next year?
Well, that's something I have to talk with my committee, that we have a public policy committee, talk with them and see what they think is important. But I know we have issues with the costs involved with FOIA. We have issues with the delays involved with FOIA. And we need to strengthen the FOIA law overall so those things can quit being used as evasion methods, if you will.
Yeah, I think Lisa brings up a good point that there's been so much focus, rightfully, on the exemption for the governor's office and the legislature that some real meat and potatoes pieces of FOIA have just languished. Even though there's a timetable for public bodies to respond to requests, there is no timetable to actually produce documents. And, there are innumerable examples of public bodies going months or even over a year before turning over records, if they turn them over at all. And then, as Lisa mentioned, there's the sky high cost estimates. Almost every journalist out there has gotten estimates back of, $50,000, $100,000 more to produce records. So there's a lot of other big issues out there.
Well, one of the other things I want to emphasize here is often when we talk about FOIA, I don't know, Zach, if you were there when then Senator Majority Leader Meekoff was speaking to a group of journalists in Grand Rapids about this issue several years ago. And he said, why should I do this just for you guys? And that belief doesn't work for me, because what you guys do is for the citizens of Michigan. You're not just doing it for yourself. You're there to inform the citizenry. And FOIA, too, and I always try to play this up during Sunshine Week, isn't just for journalists. It's for everyday citizens. And we know some of them who have seen those exorbitant costs and those horrible delays. And, it's a tool for people to know what their government is doing. And most government officials want to act like it's the biggest burden they have, whereas I feel it's an essential service.
Well, Lisa, thanks so much for joining us on MichMash. Appreciate your time, and good luck with everything you're working on.
Well, hopefully in the next couple of weeks we can have a different conversation and celebrate a little bit. Maybe it'll pass.